One Catholic belief, a pretty solid Catholic belief, is the original sin, and saying that sin entered into the world because of our actions, and it marred us, it hurt us, it damaged, let's say, the human being. And there is one tendency that we all have as human beings that we believe is the effect of original sin. There are a couple of other ones. We talk about concupiscence and all of that. But what would be something that really kind of wounded the human being that causes lots of problems nowadays? And of course, St. Paul deals with that in that first reading. It's a tendency to judge and to compare ourselves with other people. Because and then feeling a certain way, whether we're better or worse, whether we feel good about ourselves or bad, it's a big comparing. Maybe mothers do that with the way their children behave at Mass. And look, if I could just be like that mother, what does she do that gets her kids to behave and I can't seem to get mine? Or that I can't believe that she's not taking care of her child. Look at her, just letting him do whatever he wants. I would never do such a thing. We do, that tendency to compare is a deep wound within us, because it's very clear in Jesus' teaching, that's not part of the Christian experience. It's not part of God's world, that the only final one is God to judge. And in Jesus' time, we realize that this tendency to judge and to compare, that's part of maybe the haves and the haves not, the class filled for society who gets to be what, has been around for a long, long time. It's deep within us. Sometimes even when we don't like it about ourselves, it ends up surfacing because it's part of that human nature that only God can heal. And in dealing with it today is that really we all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, as St. Paul says, right? And we answer for no one else but ourselves. And we do not have to give an account for someone else's life. We give an account for our own life, right? And that's really, really important. We don't answer for anyone else in terms of the decisions they made. We answer for the decisions that we make and our free choices that we do, and for whatever is part of our life that we ask God to, for some mercy upon us, But it doesn't mean that we sort of go around and we don't give an accountability of this world to see for the things that happen here, because there are things that are wrong and we don't want them a part of our life. And so we can judge actions and say, that kind of action is not something I support, this is something I believe is right. Or we could call something evil, an action that's evil, this is evil. However, the good or bad, or right or wrong, or the good or bad in one's life, or the final judgment of whether one goes to heaven or not, whether one's in God's favor, whether one's doing what God thinks about, that's for God, and that's not for us, and that we believe that we live, as St. Paul says, for God alone, right? Whether we live or we die, we belong to the Lord. We are the Lord's. In the end, that's what matters. Right? And our goal is to, as we navigate here, to make sure that we recognize that we don't give an accountability for anyone else's life in terms of God. That, as St. Paul says, that is reserved to him alone. So as we continue, we remember there's a lot to be wounded. There's a lot of parts of original sin that has wounded the human nature, that causes kinds of divisions in among us, that we believe only God can heal. And so if you've experienced things like judgment, or you feel insecure because you feel judged right away based on whatever had gone on in your life, to recognize that ultimately it's really about how you stand before the Lord, right? And you give an accounting, as Paul says, you give an accounting for your life. So each one of us shall give an accounting of himself, herself, before God. That is all that matters.